Firstly, let me put time constraints. Obviously, anybody can leave at any time. But since I'm going to leave at a certain time, I might end it if you... so I think half an hour to 3/4 of an hour is maximum. Don, who doesn't normally dress with a tie, or maybe now does from now on, he's trying to get some respectability to this conference, has to go to a wedding. Is that right? Two weddings. You're going to both of them? So you want to really leave in how long? 10 minutes. So my suggestion is that he just take over and answer questions for 5 minutes. Then I will maybe say 5 minutes as to what this unreasonable effectiveness, it's a question I have that I think is philosophical that maybe people have comments on. And then I suggest Henrik is definitely going to do what he promised. And I'm sure Alain Kohn might want to participate with some general. So I would say the last 15 minutes is about the Riemann hypothesis. So we're 6:15 to 6:30. And before that, let's talk about modular forms, though Don can, of course, talk about whatever he wants. So Don, come up here to field questions. Or perhaps you can even respond to my question. I was going to explain it further, but you know very well what I'm going to ask as to, well, the question is, in this modern time, it's the turn of the 20th century, and this is what this conference is about, the field of modular forms, which I think for many people here looks very esoteric. It looks like this is kind of the last lecture. This might have been Ramanujan himself running up and down, writing down formulas. And the subject that most might have felt died at the turn of last century is alive and kicking in such a way that there are problems, I'll list them afterwards, just to give examples, whose solution are entirely dependent on modular forms. It's in the foregrounds as we move into this next century. And I have often wondered, and I know many other people have wondered, why is this subject still here and so effective at resolving problems which seemingly have nothing to do with it? So that's the philosophical question that I want to discuss, and I'll elaborate on that for 3 minutes after you. But you might want to give me your view on that.
I would love to hear yours, but I mean, I can only confirm that it's so much true that if anyone shows me a generating function of anything at all, if I ever see a generating function of anything, I assume it will be a modular form, and if it isn't, I'm always very surprised. So I can only confirm that indeed, in the most unlikely situations, things are always modular. But why? Either philosophically or practically. Well, it's maybe someday it will be. Yeah, it's Q, but it's not clear yet. At least.
All right. Are there anybody who want to ask questions about his lecture? Because
since I really have to go. Yeah. So.
Could you say in 1 minute what the connection between the theory of whatever fact you presented about Mach theta function was and this period relations of the Dedekind sum and the Lewis-Meyer, whatever it is, if there is a connection?
There is, even with the period thing, although I was thinking more of the half-integral weight. In some of the cases, I don't know if the microphone, I'll just shout. In some of the cases, for instance, well, actually, a student of mine who proved several of the identity dimensions for some Wegers in Utrecht found that if you take the sum, like the one that I wrote, q to the n squared, or I forget what it was, 1 plus q squared, I think, after 1 plus q to the n squared. And now if you do something rather crazy with it, you simply invert q. Then it turns out that the series, as it stands, still converges. So it converges also outside the unit disk as well as inside, but again not on the unit disk. And again, the two things are limit. As you come from, thank you. I'll do that. As you come from inside or outside, you get the same limit. So again, you get this limiting behavior. And now it turns out that in many cases, these things are of the form of the thing we saw at the end, q to the n squared over something. In other words, they're semi-half integrated theta series. And so that's on the Mach side. I mean, this story is actually much longer. But in particular, the limiting values at roots of unity can be made to be the same. So there are examples where the limiting values you get at roots of unity from a Mach theta function are exactly the same as you get from a true modular form. But they're really the same from the opposite side. It's q from above and q from below. And there's also at least one beautiful example in the mass case there's a specific form on gamma 0, 2 with eigenvalue of quarters, S is a half. An extremely beautiful example which was studied, well, the original example was due to Ramanujan, rediscovered by Dyson, and then the identities were proved by Anderson, Hickerson, and Henri Cohen gave an interpretation. And what they found, what Henri Cohen found, is that a certain Q series, again Q to some quadratic form over some product, exactly like Ramanujan's and Euler's series, if you wrote this as CMQ to the n, then the CNs were nothing. They said no modular properties. But if you multiplied them instead by a K-Bessel function, the same coefficients, then this new function was a modular, a mass multiform on gamma 0, 2. This was Henri Cohen's discovery. But it's very strange, because if you do this, there's no multiplicative thing, there's no Q. But now you see that's exactly the story I told. This is the sum AN, and this is the F. And this is the associated F tilde. And there what you get exactly is one of Ramanujan's functions. I don't know if he called it modular, and it has the same property of interesting algebraic values at root 2, and the whole story goes through. So in at least one example, everything fits together. But in that example, it's arithmetic. It's one of the few arithmetic examples of a mass waveform, because the eigenvalues are quarter and the ANs are also integers. Whereas in general, the eigenvalue and the ANs are all transcendental. So it's a mass. No, it's not one of the theta series. It's less trivial. It belongs to an Arden L series for some other number field. It's not one of the mass theta series. But it does. It's a true L series in the sense of Peter. I mean, it's got a multiplicative expansion, which I can write down. It has all of the properties, but it corresponds to a non-trivial Arden L series. So there really is a connection, not just a formal similarity.
Yomdin? Maybe come down.
No, I can hear if you scream.
You mentioned this, if you compare two modular forms, it's enough to see that only finite number,
Sure.
Number of coefficients coincide.
Sure.
The forms coincide. Now, in combinatorics, as far as I understand, Ranovic principle or something like this, by Zandberger, it is true only for part of, it is known only for part of combinatoric validation. Can you comment a little bit on this?
Well, that's sort of part of the general question. Why do modular forms come up? Let's say when the combinatorial identity has any modular underpinnings, when it comes from something modular, then it works, and a finite number of terms suffices. And in general, I think it doesn't. I mean, I think it's a special property of modular forms. But maybe, I'm not a combinatorialist, maybe other people know other classes. But this principle, so far as I know, only works in the modular world.
Is that work, it appears as a result of some kind of demodulus technique?
In modular forms, it just appears from finite dimensionality of the space.
Yeah, no, I mean, in very special, you're right, in Zeilberger's thing with these automatic proofs and so on, then indeed, if you have certain types of differential equations, then you can prove certain finite dimensionality results, and if two series are of the same type and agree far enough, then indeed you're done. But that's, I think, rather different from this. Here you don't need any functional equation, so you simply have the coefficients. That I think is different. Yeah.
Oh,
Any?
Yeah, one more.
This result of
Those?
you have a relation, you have one relation for psi function.
Yeah, come talk.
Well, I can repeat it afterwards.
All right.
I can repeat it. I speak much faster. Yeah.
So the psi function is a solution to equation, this S parameter there, and it is just one equation when the modular group has two generators. So you somehow captured these two in one thing.
That's not so surprising. That I can answer very briefly. I will. He said, why is it that we could associate to a mass waveform on the group SL2Z a function psi of z, remember, holomorphic function, which satisfied only one relation relating the values at z plus 1 and 1 over z plus 1, just one equation, when actually there are two generators. And the answer is this. I associate to one of the generators the translation, the function 0, and to the other the value function psi of z. And now I extend this uniquely to a cocycle by requiring the cocycle property. A cocycle you only have to specify on generators, and here one generator goes to 0. And the fact that this can be extended to a cocycle requires psi to satisfy the identity, and it's that identity. So this simply is expressing the cohomology of gamma with coefficients in a certain thing, but it took us a very long time, again partly with the help of Joseph Bernstein, to understand how this works, and that's a long story that I'll tell you separately if you're interested. It's a very pretty story, but there's a purely cohomological interpretation in terms of co-cycles. But they're always, as in the classical weight K theory, it's parabolic co-cycles, which means that the parabolic element goes to 0. And so here, one of the generators goes to 0, and so you only need to know one other generator. Yeah, it's because it's a cuspidal form. Sorry?
Now, after your explanation, I'm ready to ask my question.
You asked one question.
No, I didn't.
You said, why is there only one equation when there are two generators? You can have another.
No. First question is, what happens if it's a complete?
What?
If it's not a formal?
I don't want to talk. It's a long story. I mean, I was giving examples of this. It's a 60-page paper, and it's only for SL2Z, and another 60-page paper. Yeah.
We should talk about
Yeah. So I don't want to go into that here. It's still, the cohomological point of view still works, but that's a long and involved story. So. No one
Okay,
has-
go enjoy
okay.
your
Yeah, exactly.
wedding, or your
Thank
two
you.
weddings. I don't know how you do that.
There's an expression. about
Religious
that.
wedding?
Maybe some are, some aren't. I'm not sure.
You might be educated.
Okay, so.
Okay, so maybe 15 minutes, and this, I hope everybody who's thought about this or wants to comment will comment. So the question, I guess there's a paper of Wigner, which has got the title, and I read the paper. It was a current lecture he gave, actually. The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in Physics. He raises the question, and basically he doesn't answer it. He just says, look, he points out the success is sort of unreasonable, and he points to various things. He defines math, he defines physics. So here, I just thought that this might be a good topic to at least move into, or way to get people to talk. As I was saying, modular forms are at the root of solution of many problems. I made a list here. Just let me mention a few of them. Gromov was saying you have to feel objects, you have to see them. How do you explain to the man on the street? A concept's only good if, I was a bit confused about. At some point it was the man on the street if he understood it, it was terrible. That was at the Dead Sea. But before, in the first lecture, if the man on the street didn't understand, if we couldn't feel it, then is it really there? Varieties, you have to feel varieties, and he could listen.
I just said that when people motivate the equation with something being natural, it's a very poor explanation. Because
okay, but on the first day, you were talking about feeling and so on. Now, if you go to the man on the street, or even if you go to a lot of our colleagues here who view us as writing these funny formulas, and explain to them this is crucial in the solution, and then you start defining modular forms, and you say Adele, and that's the end, and they kind of blank out. So
that's a good sign. So we have to continue.
I would say it's a bad sign. Anyway, this is a subject which I think by many definitions you could view as somewhat esoteric, yet of course it's highly connected to symmetries in semi-simple groups. So let me start by just listing a few problems. Of course, obviously the first one is Fermat's last theorem. There are two parts there. The one is Frey's reduction to, and of course there's Ribot's contribution, but Frey's reduction to the issue of whether all elliptic curves are modular, or as much as you need of that. So Fermat seems nothing to do with modular forms, but after that step, and it's a brilliant, simple and unexpected step, the problem does become one of elliptic curves in modular forms. But as I was saying earlier, this is now based on something which I think was a very daring conjecture, so daring, I believe, that Shimura, who certainly has told me many times this is what he believed in the early 60s, he never wrote it down anywhere because he was scared, I would say. Of course, Weil was the first to formalize it. So it is such an unexpected thing that modular forms are so powerful as to capture all elliptic curve L functions that one has to wonder, is this something that is needed in the proof of Fermat, or something that in the second part, which has to do with elliptic curves, is this something that we're lucky about? I mean, why did it turn out that way? Alain Kohn already is arguing that not all L functions come from modular forms. I would say the theory of L functions and the theory of modular forms are one and the same, and he can put up his counterexample in the function field in a moment. But in the number field case, I don't know any counterexamples. It's a philosophical issue. So Fermat's last theorem is one obvious example. Ivanich was explaining examples in GL2. So you're using the upper half plane to understand the Dirichlet L function. Zagier just ran out, but here's one of the best examples. There's a great theorem of Goldfeld, Gross, and Zagier, which proves an old conjecture of generalization about class numbers, effective bounds for class numbers, using elliptic curves and modular forms in a way that before you start, this has nothing to, the problem of Gauss doesn't seem to have anything to do with modular forms, and the only solution we know uses all that. Okay, so there are obviously many Diophantine problems, and that's perhaps not surprising. But of course there are areas which have nothing to do with number theory even, where these things enter. I give an example which obviously I like, Ramanujan graphs. These are graphs which are highly connected, optimal, and sparse. And the only construction known is through modular forms. There is no, they come out of algebraic curves, but the curves have to somehow be connected with modular forms in this construction. Nobody knows how to just use algebraic geometry directly. So somehow these modular curves, they also enter in codes that beat the Gilbert-Varashamov bounds. You make curves which come from modular curves themselves, and they somehow are beating random. Now, beating random in this world is an achievement. People view in high dimensions random is best, but these things allow you to construct things that are better than random. I think the results that Margulis was describing with his work and Ratner's work on the Oppenheim conjecture, which was a classical problem in analytic number theory, and its solution used not ordinary modular forms, but certainly uses the homogeneous space SL3R of SL3Z, as Margulis explained, came out of the blue. Nobody knows how to do this problem classically, and it's probably not in the cards using the circle method. So it's another case where somehow the space, if we extend the definition of modular forms so as to have many more people participate here, to really be the analysis of the representation theory of G mod gamma, why is it so much at the forefront? And of course, there are all these examples that Zagir was talking about in topology, in Katz-Moody groups, and so on, where you get modular forms out of certain constructions. Borchardt has constructions, but I think in all those cases, if I may say so myself, that's much closer to 19th century modular forms. That is that you make modular forms that are series, and they have an invariance because of some other property that maybe conformal field theory gives you SL2Z invariance. There's a reason these things are invariant. And in many cases, these things do not obey multiplicative properties. It's the additive theory that's really entering there. But nevertheless, it's modular forms, and there are the two styles, the one which is the theory of L functions, and the one which is the sort of 19th century modular forms. I should say the person responsible for bringing modular forms back as far as L functions this century is Hecker. Hecker really revived what seemed to be a dead subject. And of course, it was picked up by many people. Gromov, perhaps modular forms, which of course are intimately connected with moduli spaces of abelian varieties and curves. Maybe this is the answer to your, in some sense. We don't know any varieties. And moduli spaces, as was pointed out by a number of people, are one of the few higher dimensional varieties we can study. Of course, we don't see them. We don't write equations for them. But we nevertheless are able to study them. And in that sense, they are in our hands. Or maybe it's just, I'm giving you my answers. Maybe it's just got to do with the fact that symmetry is the big thing these days. And if you want discrete symmetries, which have to do with number theory, then it's G mod gamma. Okay, but I don't think those are the answers. And I've often wondered, and many people have wondered about why this is so effective, this esoteric field. And I hope people will come and maybe try to answer that. And after 10, 15 minutes, we'll turn to some speculations about the Riemann hypothesis.
So what is the relation between modular forms and quantum field theory?
Kashtan, do you know about
In a sense, you're writing forms as integrals. You start with elliptic curve. You produce something which, when you write a functional integral, is written in terms of elliptic curve. But when you want to compute this integral, you represent this elliptic curve as a portion of C star mod Q, mod multiplication. The moment you express it like this, you get an answer in some kind of formal power series in Q. But since you know that actually your integral is related to an elliptic curve, and the same elliptic curve corresponds to different Q, different So you have to represent the elliptic curve as a portion of upper half plane, you have to cut it. And so you choose a cycle, you cut it, you open it, the cylinder, and then you write your expression. But since your original expression didn't depend on the cutting, so you get immediately answer is invariant under modular transformations. So it really depends only the point defined by this. So space of elliptic curves is exactly a quotient of upper half plane, but by SL to Z. So this way of representation immediately tells you the modular invariance.
Well, I think the example that I gave on Friday
Perhaps,
is not so obvious.
Come up. It's simpler than passing this weird thing around.
No, but I think the example that I spoke about on Friday is not so obvious why the modular form appears, but it's completely there.
Zev, do you want to say something? Want to ruminate?
Rumination is correct. I have maybe a sociological or psychological explanation. Number theorists are people who study very particular problems. And this is a question that if you walk outside when people are having coffee, people come and ask you, what is interesting about this or that particular talk? And I think that number theorists study very particular examples, and they like it for its own sake. And I don't think the primary goal of a number theorist is to have a theory of everything. They're quite happy to solve Fermat's theorem, or to show there are infinitely many twin primes, or the Riemann hypothesis, which we'll get to later. But in this game, there are very few tools, and one of them is the theory of modular forms, maybe because the things that we can solve have a very simple structure. For instance, as was mentioned, you're parameterizing the space of lattices or elliptic curves by something that intrinsically has the modular group built into it. And maybe I think the reason that modular forms are so effective, it's just because we look at very specific problems and use them as a tool to solve them. And if there was a way to tackle a problem like the infinitude of twin primes by the theory of modular forms, then we would all be happy. Right now, I don't know if there is, but maybe someone else does have a way.
Yeah, come up.
I have an example of non-effectiveness modular form. It's really so it's a great problem in physics to describe conformal field series. There's no example in dimension greater than 2, none at all. So that's except what's called free field, but it's not really compact. And if one boils it down to what we'll get when we get a function, z from what, and it looks really very familiar. And get the function on the beloved space of automorphic forms, and the function has a property that it should. Sorry, and dimension of space-time. 2, 3, okay. And the property is if you can make a lattice, so fix some gamma naught in Rn-1 lattice and add time t, maybe some shift. And if gamma naught is fixed, so I consider this maybe better put here JLN and here put times R plus R. So lattice is up to scalar. So as a function, if n-1 dimension lattice is fixed and is varies, then this function should have expansion some certain exponents minus certain energies depending on gamma naught times t. So infinite sum. There's no, I know only one example of such function, and it's not related with modular forms. In dimension 2, in fact, it's not really modular forms which comes as partition functions in conformal field series. They are squares of modular forms. And modular forms have analogous expansions, but they're here Bessel functions. Maybe there's something like relation between mock theta function modular forms, but the problem is that there's no really construction of such things, and it's a great problem from mathematicians just to find any such function. I know one, but it's my secret, and
I know one, maybe.
no. There's one. No, there's some. No. There are functions like.
2 million problem, right?
Zero knowledge, guys.
Yeah. No. There are functions which are constants. No, there are functions which are constants. 1, 2, 3. It's but there's some finite of zeros, and but there is essentially one example in this infinite sum. And
Well, I think you point to something here that's fundamental in modular form theory, is that the minute n is 3 here, this is not a Hermitian symmetric space, so you automatically lose all holomorphic structure. That doesn't mean you lose automorphic forms, of course, but so many things depend on the Hermitian structure, and we don't even think about it. So those cases where I said Ramanujan was solved by Berlin was GL2. There are some other cases where you have Hermitian symmetric space structure, but otherwise, so the minute you start with
SL3,
SL3 at some function there, you are on virgin territory.
Yeah.
Unless it's an Eisenstein series. It's not. That's the one I need.
What was that discussion about?
He was, no, he seemed to predict some function which is supposed to be a function on the space of lattices. But I didn't know what the function was, what his function is, but I'm just saying in general. Yeah. Oh, on a torus. So if you have a function which is a function on a space of flat tori, it lives there. That's obvious. But I'm not sure. But is that enough to identify?
Equal to what?
You.
It's not easy to write such a sum which will modular invariant, because what's written here is a function on GLR mod SO.
Right.
This is easy to write.
Yes.
But the fact that such an expression will have a modular invariance under SNNT is very strong condition.
Yeah, it's overdetermined system.
Yeah.
Then we write like this. And
I can give you
I was just pointing out that we don't have anything like the eta function or anything that you saw in the previous lecture in this case. Anything explicit of that nature does not exist.
some indices.
No, but what are the properties of this function?
No, that's suspension in. No, the problem is that coefficients are one.
who is who there? What was the help in
Some indices. Infinite set of real numbers. No, infinite set, and here are real numbers. That's it. If you just consider one parameter family of lattices, just stretching one direction, then it should be sum of exponent. And the problem is that coefficients are +1. It's not arbitrary, it's exponential.
But these are not the eigenvalues
The eigenvalue, the spectrum of Hamiltonian.
of the flat torus,
Yeah.
for example.
Yeah.
No, but then
No, the eigenvalues in some Hilbert space. Or something.
okay, I
Then
can't
you said
answer
you
that.
have to write a function which is SLNZ invariant set this form.
Yeah.
For any sequence of constants, E alpha.
No, depending on.
Depending on
They're automatically SLN minus 1 C invariant.
Yes.
It depends on the lattice.
Yeah.
The condition that it is SLN invariant is very non-trivial condition.
Does he?
It's like modularity.
Right.
You write a function which is naturally invariant under 1, 1, 0, 1. This is very
Right, and together they
The
generate.
condition that is also invariant under conditional transformation is strong condition.
Sorry? You were saying you know one example. Yes.
Victor Katz, you want to say something about why modular forms might enter into this world? example, try to explain why you can't information, why modularity, why it's ubiquitous.
Yes. So my example is the following. It's a very general construction, actually. Let us take Lie algebra, say SLN, but with coefficients in Laurent polynomials, where t is e to the I theta. So it just maps of the circle to the Lie algebra SLN. Now it has a central extension, which I don't want to explain. And also, d over d theta is the derivation of this Lie algebra. And so we can take a semi-direct product. Let me multiply also by pi. Now let's consider representation V, so it is irreducible representation. Of this thing, such that this, let me denote this operator by H, it's a Hamiltonian, such that the spectrum of H is bounded below. And then we just take trace of Q to the H. Now,
Parameter.
Q is just indeterminate.
Zaghi as parameter.
Yeah, it's e to the 2 pi I tau. Now, it turns out that this is, in many cases, a modular form if you actually subtract certain constant here. We see the so-called central charge. And kind of a very vague reason for that, why it is a modular form, is what,
for SL2Z,
what David
right?
said.
Or subgroup of SL2Z.
It's a modular form of some congruent subgroup of SL2Z. It is always a modular form if, so it is a modular form a sufficient condition is that
Still the quantum field theory is that.
But the
Yeah.
thing is exactly example I was saying.
Yeah.
if this representation can be integrated to the group. SL. Yeah, it can be lifted to the representation of the group. Now, you can do also the following thing. Let's take in SLN a subalgebra, a reductive subalgebra P. Then you can take here the subalgebra P of TT inverse and restrict the representation. If you restrict, you get the whole representation V will be decomposed into isotypic components, say U lambda, with respect to the subalgebra. And each of them will appear some number of times, say V lambda. Then it turns out that if you take this character restricted to each U lambda of the same thing, now this will depend on the subalgebra. Then it's again a modular form. And if you take all these modular forms which are obtained in this way, you get an SL2Z invariant collection of modular forms. Now, I said that this is a sufficient condition that this is a modular form. And you can study a question to find kind of modular invariant representations, namely representations for which this is a modular form. It turns out that the class of such representations is wider. But when you repeat for this representation this construction, it's not a modular form anymore, but it seems to be something like a fake modular form.
I must tell you a story about this guy. He came to give a colloquium at Princeton once. He comes into my office an hour before. He says, "Do you know this thing's modular?" So I looked at it and I said, "No." So then he starts his lecture by saying, "It is a well-known hard problem to prove, as Sarnak has said in print, that this is a modular form." So then Nick Katz sitting in the front line says, "I can prove it." So I didn't like that trap you put me in. Yeah, okay, so let's end off here with 15 minutes of real speculation. And Henrik has 5 minutes to complete his lecture, so I think he has slides.